The story begins. Charles King, a 75-year-old African-American veteran, sat quietly in a small corner of a bustling diner. His old but clean jacket clung to his slender shoulders, and his hands rested gently on a cup of coffee that was slowly cooling. Each time the diner door creaked open, his eyes instinctively turned toward it, waiting. The lively chatter and laughter of the other patrons filled the room, but Charles seemed oblivious. He sat patiently, unaware that humiliation and trouble would arrive before his son did. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you enjoy captivating and inspiring stories, don't forget to subscribe for the latest videos. Wishing you joy and peace. The diner door swung open. Two police officers entered, Ryan and Carter. Their badges gleamed as their eyes scanned the room for an empty table. They quickly noticed Charles, the older black man sitting alone. Ryan leaned toward Carter and muttered something with a smirk. Both men burst into laughter, the sharp sound cutting through the lively atmosphere. To them, Charles looked out of place in this diner, situated in a predominantly white neighborhood. An older black man like him was a rare sight here. Without hesitation, they walked toward his table. Ryan took the lead, his tone sharp and direct. "What are you doing here?" There was no greeting, no courtesy, just a blunt demand for an explanation. Charles lifted his gaze from his coffee, his calm eyes meeting theirs. His voice was steady as he replied, "I'm waiting for my son." Ryan narrowed his eyes, clearly unimpressed by Charles's composure. Carter, standing beside him, added mockingly, "It's not every day you see a little old black man trying to fit in with the big boys, huh?" Carter's laughter echoed, as if he had just delivered the punchline to the funniest joke of the day. Charles remained silent. His hands stayed firmly on the table, his shoulders square and unwavering. He repeated himself, brief but resolute, "I'm just waiting for my son." Ryan's irritation grew. He leaned in closer, his tone heavy with disdain. "Let me see your ID." Charles moved deliberately, reaching into his pocket and retrieving a worn veteran ID card. Without breaking eye contact, he handed it over. The card, a symbol of the years he had served and sacrificed for his country, now rested in the hands of a man who saw no value in it. Ryan glanced at the card briefly, then flicked it back onto the table with a dismissive gesture. "It's probably fake." Carter chuckled loudly and added with a sneer, "Hard to believe someone like you has a veteran ID. Back in your day, wasn't your kind just washing dishes or doing manual labor?" The words were not just an insult but a deliberate attempt to diminish Charles's contributions, reducing him to a cruel stereotype. Both officers erupted in laughter, as if reminiscing about a time when people like Charles supposedly knew their place. The atmosphere in the diner grew heavy. The lively chatter and laughter that had filled the room moments ago faded into an oppressive silence. A few patrons glanced toward Charles, their eyes a mix of curiosity and unease. Some shifted in their seats as if contemplating intervening, but ultimately, they remained still. Charles sat unmoving, his hands resting lightly on the table. His shoulders remained straight despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. His gaze stayed locked on the two officers, calm and unshaken. His breaths were slow and steady, as though he was intentionally controlling them to keep the rising anger within him at bay. Ryan stepped closer, his cold eyes narrowing as he spoke, his voice sharp like a blade. "If you don't leave, we'll make you leave." Charles lifted his chin slightly, his voice firm but quiet. "I'm just waiting for my son." Before he could finish, Ryan cut him off, his words snapping through the air like a whip. "I don't want to hear it. You're just a troublemaker who doesn't belong here." Charles's body remained still, but his hands tightened briefly before relaxing again on the table. His unwavering gaze met Ryan's, his composure as steady as a mountain bracing against a storm. The tension in the room peaked. The two officers stood over Charles, their looming shadows blocking out the light. Ryan leaned in even closer, his voice lowering to a growl as if trying to force Charles into submission. "This is your last chance. Leave, or we'll drag you out." Charles slowly picked up his cup of coffee, took a measured sip, and set it back down on the table. He looked up, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm not causing any trouble. I'm just a man waiting for his son. I have every right." To be here, just like anyone else in this diner. The room was silent. Every eye in the diner was fixed on Charles, hanging on his every word, waiting to see what would happen next. Ryan hesitated for a moment, his confidence faltering under the weight of Charles's quiet determination. Then, suddenly, Ryan lunged forward, shoving the chair Charles was sitting on. The chair toppled to the floor with a resounding crash, the noise cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the diner as all eyes turned to Charles. Charles rose slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Though forced from his chair, he stood tall, his arms relaxed at his sides, and his gaze calm yet piercing. Ryan moved closer without warning and began to pat Charles down roughly. His hands searched Charles's pockets with unnecessary force, the movements sharp and aggressive. His voice was low and muttering, filled with suspicion. Gotta check. Who knows what you might be hiding? Charles remained silent, offering no resistance. Yet his fingers curled slightly, pressing into his palms, the only sign of the storm brewing inside him. His breathing remained steady but heavier now, like a volcano holding back its eruption. He stood there, enduring the rough search, his eyes fixed ahead. He did not look down, did not waver, his silent dignity speaking louder than any words ever could. Charles slowly raised his hands, his fingers spreading calmly, as if to emphasize that he had no intention of resisting. His shoulders straightened slightly, his eyes never leaving the two officers standing before him. He knew well that composure was the only shield he had to keep the situation from escalating into something dangerous. Yet inside, it felt as though a storm was building, its waves rising higher with every passing moment. Charles had once stood on battlefields, facing dangers that men like Ryan and Carter could scarcely imagine. And yet, here he was, a veteran, being treated like a criminal in his own homeland. Carter moved forward and picked up Charles's veteran hat from the table. The hat, its fabric worn and marked by time, was a symbol of pride that Charles held dear. But Carter handled it as if it were a worthless object. His lips curled into a sneer, and his eyes glinted with contempt. Then, with a light but deliberate motion, Carter let the hat fall to the floor. The sound of it hitting the ground was sharp, cold, and final. Carter gave a dry laugh and said, "People like you don't deserve to wear this." Charles stood still, his body tense, though his shoulders did not sag. For a brief moment, the muscles in his jaw tightened, and a flicker of anger lit his eyes. Yet he did not speak. Instead, Charles blinked once, inhaled deeply, and forced himself to maintain his calm demeanor. Around him, the patrons in the diner remained frozen. Some gasped unconsciously, while others rose slightly from their seats, their wide eyes reflecting disbelief at what they had just witnessed. But no one spoke. Everyone knew the reputation of these officers, men who thrived on intimidation. Ryan, finding nothing suspicious in Charles's pockets, grabbed his wrist roughly and twisted it behind his back. The force of the movement made Charles's arm stiffen, and a wince crossed his face from the pain. But he made no sound. Carter gave a harsh chuckle, his voice cutting through the tense air. "Not as tough as you think, huh, old man?" Charles clenched his teeth, his breaths becoming heavier for a moment, yet he remained silent. The pain in his wrist was but a small fraction of what he had endured in his lifetime. But this lack of respect, this was the true wound, the one that cut the deepest. "You've gone too far," Charles said, his voice steady and resolute. Each word he spoke cut through the air like a blade. "You have no idea what I've witnessed. I deserve to be treated better than this." Ryan scoffed, his eyes flashing with defiance. "You think you can tell us what to do? We'll show you who's in charge. Tonight, you'll be sleeping in a jail cell for defying the police." With a sharp motion meant to assert his authority, Ryan pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around Charles's wrists, the clinking sound echoing in the tense silence. Nearby, Carter picked up Charles's cane, a worn but sturdy stick that had been his reliable companion for many years. Without hesitation, Carter snapped the cane over his knee. The sharp crack of breaking wood rang out as the pieces fell to the floor. Tossing them aside, Carter looked at Charles with an expression full of contempt. You won't need this anymore. You're heading to a cell. They began dragging Charles toward the door, but before they could leave, Charles tilted his chin slightly, gesturing toward a small card still lying on the table. Ryan frowned but couldn't resist his curiosity. He picked up the card, glancing at it quickly. As his eyes scanned the bold letters printed on it, his hands began to tremble. The words stood out clearly, Police Commissioner King. Ryan's face turned pale, as if he had been struck by a heavy blow. The realization hit him like a hammer. The man they had insulted, humiliated, and treated like a criminal was none other than the father of their boss, the police commissioner. Every trace of arrogance drained from Ryan's face as he grasped the gravity of his actions. Charles King had lived a long life filled with sacrifice, service, and resilience. Born in the southern United States during an era of rampant segregation and racism, Charles had understood early on that life was not kind to people who looked like him. But instead of accepting his fate, he was determined to build a meaningful life. When the Vietnam War broke out, Charles volunteered to enlist, even though he knew he was fighting for a country that did not see him as equal. During the war, Charles experienced horrors no person should ever have to endure. He lost friends, faced death, and fought with every ounce of strength he had. His honorable service earned him the respect of his comrades, but upon returning home, he found that respect did not extend to civilian life. In America, Charles was still just a black man, confronting the same prejudice and discrimination he had known since childhood. After the war, Charles worked tirelessly to build a life for himself. He started a family, raised his children, and took pride in the fact that his son, Ethan King, had risen to become the police commissioner. The journey had not been easy. It was filled with challenges. Yet, Charles had never let the world break his spirit. He always maintained his dignity, even when others tried to push him down. Now, as the two young officers handcuffed him and led him away, Charles couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. He had once fought and risked his life to defend the freedoms of this country, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ryan, holding the table card bearing the name Commissioner Ethan King, trembled as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. This wasn't just a minor error. It was a blunder that could end their careers. Ryan released his grip on the old man and stammered an apology, fumbling to explain that they didn't know who Charles was, as if that could somehow justify their actions. Charles remained silent, standing still, his calm composure unshaken as he waited to see what would happen next. Carter, Ryan's partner, was no longer confident either. Instead, he found himself confronting the cold reality of the consequences they were about to face. Shame was written all over their faces as they stood there, unsure of what to do next. The other patrons, who had previously been silent out of fear, now began to feel a collective sense of relief. A few even pulled out their phones to record the moment, sensing that this story would not end well for the two officers. Charles stayed composed. He didn't need to say a word. The card in Ryan's trembling hand spoke volumes. These officers had humiliated a man who had served his country and raised a son to become one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement. Now, they would face the repercussions of their actions. Charles had lived through too much in his life to not know that everything would eventually be resolved, even if not always in the way one might expect. He had faith in his son, and he knew that justice would be served. He also knew that today would be a lesson these two officers would never forget. The diner door suddenly swung open, and Commissioner Ethan King stepped in. He was a tall man with a commanding presence that immediately silenced the room. Every head turned to look at him as he entered. Ethan's sharp eyes quickly scanned the scene, assessing the situation in moments. Without hesitation, King walked over to his father. All eyes in the diner followed his every step. As he approached, he glanced at the stains on Charles's shirt, the broken cane lying discarded on the floor. The sight hit him like a blade, cutting deep. Yet Charles lifted his head, his eyes filled with a quiet pride, his gaze toward King silently saying, "You know what to do." King turned to face the two officers. He stood tall, his eyes sharp, as though piercing through them. Yet his voice remained calm and frighteningly steady. "What do you think you're doing?" Ryan and Carter, once confident, now faltered, stepping back awkwardly. Their lips moved, but their words came out jumbled. "We didn't know who he was. We didn't recognize." King didn't move, his gaze unwavering. His words came out like a sentence. "It doesn't matter who my father is. Everyone deserves respect, no matter where they come from or their skin color. He is not just a citizen, but a veteran who served this country with honor. To treat anyone, especially a veteran, with such disrespect is unacceptable." Ryan and Carter lowered their heads. Their shoulders shook slightly as the realization settled in that there was no excuse for what they had done. King's voice was firm, final. "Leave this diner now. Tomorrow morning, report to my office." Without another word, Ryan and Carter hung their heads in shame and left the diner in silence. The patrons, who had been frozen in fear, began to relax. Some pulled out their phones, recording the moment, sensing that this would not end well for the officers. Once they were gone, King turned back to his father. He gently took Charles's hand, and with the key from his pocket, unlocked the handcuffs. The sound of the cuffs clicking open echoed as they fell to the floor. Charles rubbed his wrists, easing the tension, and slightly rolled his shoulders as though letting go of the burden. King sat down opposite his father, his expression softening as he looked at the man who raised him. His voice dropped, both apologetic and resolute. "I'm sorry I'm late. And I'm sorry for what happened." Charles tilted his head, a faint smile on his lips. His eyes met his son's, not with reproach, but with pride. "You handled it very well. That's what truly matters." The two sat in silence for a moment, no more words needed. The quietness that surrounded them felt peaceful, a calm that transcended the shame they had just endured. Despite everything that had happened, Charles held onto his dignity, knowing that his son was a man of integrity who would never back down from what was right. But the story didn't end there. News of the incident quickly spread, from the diner to the entire town and beyond. The community was outraged by the officers' actions, and many voiced their support for Charles and his family. Under Commissioner King's leadership, the police department launched an investigation into the matter. Ryan and Carter were swiftly disciplined, suspended for 6 months without pay, and required to attend mandatory training on prejudice and respect. The incident at the diner became a reminder to both the community and the police force that prejudice had no place in their town. Commissioner King's actions that day set a strong example, showing that justice and respect must always come first. For Charles King, that day became a painful memory, reminding him of the battles he fought, both on the battlefield and at home. But it also strengthened his faith in his son and the values he had instilled in him. Despite the ongoing struggles, Charles knew that change was possible, and he took pride in playing a part in making that change a reality. Do you agree with the punishment given to these two officers? Was it enough to make up for what Charles had to endure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video, share this story, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our meaningful content.